Centre for Policy Futures in Conversation webinar. First is, if you can turn your microphones off, that would be great. We will have time for Q&A. So you can obviously use your microphone then, but also if you have questions as we go through the presentation today, then you can also pop them in the chat, and I'll be sure to come to those in the time that we have before 1 o'clock. So my name is Greg Marston. I'm the Director at the Centre for Policy Futures here at the University of Queensland. I would like to acknowledge our partners on this research project we're going to talk about, Anglicare Southern Queensland. I can see that Leanne and Anna and Michelle have joined the call, so they may have contributions to make, but I do want to thank our partners for this research project that we've been conducting during the course of this year, which the focus is on recruitment and retention in the care workforce, in the paid care workforce, particularly with a focus on aged care and disability. But the issues around recruitment and retention are obviously much wider than those sectors, and all workforces in the Australian labour market face these kind of challenges, but there are some particular challenges which we'll talk to today that are particularly acute when you're talking about care work. But before we get into those issues, I do also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which we variously meet and gather today for this webinar. Here in Brisbane, that's the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, and I want to pay my respect to elders past and present, and to recognise their ongoing custodianship of the lands. And it's also, I think, worth mentioning when discussing issues of care that the burden and benefits of care are unevenly distributed, and when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. A recent survey by the Australian Human Rights Commission, for example, found that Aboriginal women and Torres Strait Islander women are doing almost twice as much unpaid care as Australian women in a recent survey in the Australian Human Rights Commission report. So it's worth acknowledging that. And one of the issues obviously is how we do redistribute care more widely across paid work and also in unpaid work. I'm just picking up someone's microphone there. Is that someone might not have theirs off? Thanks very much. All good. So Rob might just go to the program. So as I've already introduced myself, and I do want to introduce the research team, particularly Rob and Ariana, who really led the bulk of this project on the mixed method study and the analysis and the findings in close partnership, as I mentioned, with Anglicare Southern Queensland. The research itself has been released thanks to our partners for that, and we will share a link in the chat to the full report. So we'll give the key takeaways today, some of the key findings, but you can download the full report, which is available both through Anglicare and through our Centre for Policy Futures website as well. Just a little bit of scene setting from me to start with that led to this project and this partnership. As I mentioned in my introductory remarks, care work is something that gets significant attention. It's a lot of focus right now, of course, in the media around the aged care reforms in particular, around the introduction of some of the assistance around home care packages, and also obviously some concerns around what that might mean for the most vulnerable in relation to the co-payments. I think less attention gets focused on worker well-being, and that's something that got highlighted obviously during the pandemic in terms of the pay and conditions of the care workforce, which is predominantly undertaken by women, and that is the focus, of course, in some of the reforms that the government has been concerned with, but it's also sector's advocacy has really been pushing that case. Because when you're talking about recruitment and retention, there needs to be obviously recognition for that work in terms of its proper levels of remuneration, but also to get past some of the gendered norms, as I mentioned, and intersectional ways in which we think about care work, in order to value those who care and also to value care work. And when we're talking about the care economy, we are including both paid and unpaid care work, as I said, which does make a substantial contribution to Australian society and the economy. It's estimated, I think, around $90 billion in terms of unpaid care value, and it's also a key employer in terms of the social services sector. But when thinking about recruitment and retention, we do need to make sure that that work is properly valued, not just in a sort of monetised sense, but also in terms of its role in society, and that's one of the key social norms that this sort of work seeks to highlight, but also to focus right down into the level of workplace conditions and what sorts of features might attract people to do care work, and what also would encourage them to stay in that work and see it as a career. Because the relationship obviously between recruitment and retention is that we don't want to see a more diverse workforce if that workforce also has a high level of churn, because that's costly for individuals, but it's also costly for organisations, and that's not a very successful outcome. So this relationship between retention and recruitment is very close, and that's one of the things that we've sought to really highlight during the course of this research, but also to explore the sorts of options that would attract a more diverse workforce, and then also the sorts of features that people might be prepared to trade off, for example, between time and money or work flexibility, and what sorts of features people value most highly. So I don't want to take any more really of the findings and discussion away from Ariana and Rob. So I think with that, I might hand over to Rob and Ariana to talk a little bit about the methodology and the setup, and then get to the key findings and where some of the directions went. And then once Rob and Ariana have done the presentation, as I said, we'll return to focus on your discussion, your questions, and any comments you may have, because I'm sure there's a lot of experience in the room. And thanks everyone for joining. So I'll hand over to you, Rob and Ariana. Thanks.
Thanks, Greg, for that introduction. I guess to sort of elaborate a little bit on the scene setting and talk a little bit about the methodology, the mixed methods methodology we used in this project to kind of get the data and develop the insights that we've gathered. We used two different quality methods: focus group discussions and semi-structured interviews. Focus group discussions were with members of the public, a sample of around 60 people, both in person and online. This helped us sort of get some of the initial, understand the perceptions of the sector, how people perceived it, where the challenges and the barriers. The semi-structured interviews were with people already in the sector, some of the frontline staff, disability support workers, youth workers, aged care workers, both in home and in aged care and youth facilities. And this, again, sort of spoke more to the retention dimension. As Greg mentioned, we're looking both at attracting people into the space, but also how do we retain people in the space? There's no point in bringing new people in if there's not a sort of a sustainable way of people staying in the sector. Both of these qualitative methods also then informed our discrete choice survey experiment, which we developed in collaboration with ASQ. Discrete choice survey experiments, for those who aren't familiar, are experiments where survey participants, in this case we had sort of 2,900 survey participants, are given two different, in this case, job descriptions with different attributes around wage, around different sorts of flexibility, around contract type, around different organisational supports. From those two, survey participants will select one or the other. In this case, they selected, there was six different options in aged care and six different options in youth work. So overall, we had sort of 36,000 data points, which helped us inform which one of these dimensions are prioritised by the populace in our final data set. In terms of how we're going to sort of break down the findings, we've got these sort of 9 core themes that we're going to talk to. As you will see as we go through the slides, we've tried to really bring some of those participant voices from those focus groups and from the semi-structured interviews out into the findings. So I'm going to start with some of the broader perceptions around the sector that came out of the focus groups. And as you can see on the right-hand side here, we've actually got some of those, the contributions from a student, a male student from that focus group. So broadly, there were different motivations and barriers for people, the way they understood the community care sector. There were these intrinsic ones, which were about the specific aspects of the work itself. So making a difference in people's life, doing meaningful work. These were some of the highest motivations for people to potentially go into aged care, youth work, and the community care sector. Providing support to vulnerable groups, more prioritised than women than men, building relationships with elderly people, and then mentoring young people and being a role model. Particularly with young people, this was seen as a reason to potentially move into this space. Extrinsic factors, which were more about sort of the HR dimensions, if you will, of the work. There was a perceived flexibility in working hours, the fact that it is a growing industry and there's more and more going to be more and more work opportunities. There was a dimension around work security. So a growing and secure industry was seen as also one of some of those motivations. Young people also perceive this as being a job that provides good pay. What this means more broadly, and I think something that we sort of discussed with ASQ, and I think for the sector more widely, is there's opportunity to actually develop marketing campaigns targeted towards different demographics that highlight these different intrinsic rewards for why they want to enter the sector. In contrast, there are also a series of barriers that were identified along the way. So the emotional burden of the job, and if I draw your attention to that comment on the right from a physiotherapist who was in part of the focus groups, they kind of acknowledge this idea that you're, particularly in aged care, you're working with people who will pass away, and that has an emotional dimension to it, and that's challenging and a reason some people actually would not want to join this space. Equally, there was a physical dimension of the work, and potentially one around physical safety. So particularly women, when talking about youth work, highlighted that there was a physical safety aspect that might mitigate them wanting to actually move into the space. Again, extrinsically, in this case, the social status and image of the sector, I think everyone on the call is aware of the Aged Care Royal Commission and some of the way that framed and informed people's understanding of the sector, and also this idea that it's a low-paid job. This is quite interesting because in the previous slide, we talked about people perceiving it as a high-paid job. So I think there's quite a big difference in how people understand and perceive the sector more broadly. Finally, there was some ambiguity and uncertainty around entry requirements, what one is required to join the sector, and this as such end up creating a barrier for people potentially wanting to join, and then perceived limited career progressions. So again, I think what this means for us and the research is there's opportunities to create more broader public education initiatives around the value of care work to challenge some of these negative perceptions. There's been recently, a couple of years ago, Queensland Police had an interesting advertising campaign that kind of spoke to some of these, and I think the Defence Force have got similar ones. So I think there's other lessons we can learn from other sectors in this regard as well. I'm going to hand it over to Adianda to talk a bit more about some of the specific dimensions of the survey and how we garnered some of the results from those.
Thank you, Rob. Indeed, now I will go more in depth into some of the results that pertain to the individual job attributes that we studied, both through the focus group discussions, the discrete choice experiment, and also some of these were part of the interviews with people already in the sector, so what we call the retention interviews. So the first, I would say, finding that emerges strongly when we look at, for example, preferences for contract type and leave arrangements, is that permanent full-time work is still the preferred options over all other type of contractual arrangements. And this is especially strong among younger cohorts and men. And particularly, you don't see it here, but men with dependents seem to be the ones that have the strongest preference for permanent full-time work, which points to the relevance still, I would say, of breadwinning expectations for men, particularly, that probably cannot afford to work less than a permanent full-time job in terms of the work hours and the security. And this has important implications for the sector that is highly casualized. So where casual contracts are indeed the standard. At the same time, we also find that casual contracts can be improved. For example, when we propose people jobs with different arrangements, they were more likely to choose contracts that also that are casual but offer prorated leave compared to standard casual contracts. And this is particularly so among younger people. When I say casual contracts with prorated leave, we essentially imagine casual contracts where people can accumulate leave as they work, which is not the standard at the moment. So this seems to be a way in which these contracts can be improved. And finally, we do find a preference for a stronger preference, I would say, for part-time work over casual work permanent part-time work over casual work among women, particularly those with dependents. At the same time, though, I want to remark that permanent full-time work was preferred across both genders over other things. So both men and women preferred it, just men preferred it more. This highlights indeed still the importance that permanent full-time work is a stability of income essentially has for certain cohorts. We'll move to the next slide. The other aspect that we investigated in depth is flexibility and work-life balance. So from the focus groups emerged that indeed people perceived flexibility as a way and valued it as a way to balance personal and caregiving responsibilities, and also to mitigate the emotional demands of these particular jobs. So there was an acknowledgement, even so focus group participants were not in the sector. I wanted to remark that, but indeed the sector has a reputation of jobs in aged care and youth work of being emotionally demanding, and flexibility was seen as a way to work around these periods indeed of, for example, more emotional stress. At the same time, though, focus groups participants were skeptical of the viability of implementing flexible work arrangements in this sector, especially with complex cases, so people that have complex needs, and for which there's an assumption that consistency and continuity of care would be more important. And they also highlighted the perception of attention between flexibility and quality of care. Finally, indeed, in the experiment we did, the jobs pairs that we proposed to people contained also different types of flexibility arrangements. The baseline was indeed no flexibility, and then flexible work start and finish time, the compressed work week, and finally we also introduced gig work style flexibility, which is, in essence, people could choose their own schedule in a similar way as is possible to do through online platform work platforms. And what we find indeed is that, as you can see from the chart above, gig work style flexibility was the option that was most preferred compared to the other arrangements, and in particular compared to no flexibility. And this was particularly so for women, both with and without dependents. And this is particularly interesting because although it shows that indeed flexibility in this case doesn't move the dial as much as permanent full-time work, this is the results we saw before, in terms of magnitude, it's actually smaller, a lot smaller. At the same time, it attracts more women, hence the risk of, again, extracting in the sector the usual suspects, so it could undermine diversity. Next slide. Another key aspect is organizational support. As I mentioned before, focus group participants acknowledged and understand that roles, particularly in aged care and in youth work, might come with are emotionally demanding jobs, and emphasize that they would want, if they were to undertake these kind of roles, they would want to have substantial supports in the job. And this included at the very base mental health support, so counseling, trauma support, and indeed practical, in essence, practical benefits that allow individuals to take control of their mental health, especially when things at work escalate or become complicated. So the other thing is we found some support among focus group participants for other types of organizational support. For example, the possibility of having a senior mentor, which is a a person that has been in their role, frontline workers that have significant experience and can support more junior staff in a confidential way in dealing with particularly the emotional side of the job. And then another mechanism, form of organizational support that emerged and that received some support in the focus groups and also in the retention interviews, in establishing peer learning systems. Hence, for example, having a rotational job share forms of work arrangements where two people take care of the same person, for example, and rotate, and that way they can share not just the burden of the job, but also notes and other aspects that have to do more with the emotional journey that comes with taking care of others. Then, I mean, we actually took all of these suggestions and trialed them on the job ads through the experiments where we had people indeed could see in the job advertisements either a standard mental health support through the employee assistance program, having a senior mentor as described above, or sharing the care of someone with a peer. And what we find is indeed that in job advertisements, actually, these additional supports can paradoxically deter potential applicants, and particularly men in aged care, men for aged care roles, sorry. Hence, it's important to, while these supports are essential for retention, it's important to frame them carefully when it comes to attraction to avoid heightening the emotional burden of the job from our perception perspective. Finally, as Rob has already anticipated, an important element is the perception of the lack of opportunities for development in this sector. So there is a perception of limited career pathways. And in general, this perception that the sector is sort of not providing, that is generally is about horizontal organizations where there's not much room for progression. One suggestion came up from the qualitative part of the work was around fostering professionalism through shared opportunities for opportunities to share learnings, and this is particularly for staff, for example, conferences, for example, opportunities instead for people from different organizations to actually come together and talk about their work, as well as obviously more concretely investment in training, which has been declining, I mean, from the funding structure. And what we did finally, so taking the findings from the focus groups, we tried in the job ads in the survey experiment to trial different ways to market opportunities for development, to see if there's, for example, providing head training opportunities, more concrete opportunities would move the dial, but we don't find much of an effect in this respect, possibly because the people, when it comes to the attraction piece, so the first impression on a job, place more value on more concrete attributes like the contract type, flexibility, wages, and also possibly the sector has there's a negative reputation in that it substantially promotes dead-end jobs, and it's possible that it's not that easy to nudge that away by just changing a statement on a job ad, essentially. Again, another important piece is around indeed low pay, and in particular, there's a perception that given the burden of the job and the emotional burden, given how much goes into actually doing these jobs, essentially the pay doesn't match the amount of effort and skills that are required, really. At the same time, though, we find that employment security is actually more important than increased hourly wages for attraction. So when we put on job ads different pay levels, essentially, we'd find a larger effect. So people choose the job more when it comes with permanent full-time work than when it comes with a 20% wage increase, in essence. And I think this is very important for the way the sector is funded and what kind of contracts it can offer. Also, through this exercise, we estimated something called willingness to pay. That is essentially the monetary value that people attach to various job attributes. In essence, is how much people want to be compensated through wages for having to, for example, do more emotionally draining work, or how much they would give away to have better contract types. And what we find is a large willingness to pay for permanent full-time work. So unsurprisingly, based on what I mentioned earlier, so people would cut their wage to have stability. So this is quite interesting. Also, some willingness to pay for gig work style flexibility, but indeed not as much as for permanent full-time work. And also they require to be actually paid. So they would like to have a higher wage to accept jobs that require extra supports, like indeed sharing your work with your buddy or receiving support from a senior mentor. And that happens because, as I mentioned, signals the burden of the job most likely, and hence, which requires a higher compensation. Speaks to the piece around, given how much skills and effort goes into this, we would need people who want to be paid more. Finally, at least on this piece around pay, we find a sweet spot. To increase attraction across different sectors, it is in between $47 and $56 an hour. For that wage range, we have maximized attraction from a very broad range of the working population. Next slide. Importantly, jobs in aged care and youth work require specific qualifications, which can represent additional barriers to entry. We do ask explicitly in the survey if people would be willing to actually undertake these further qualifications. And while we find indeed that 30 to 40% of people wouldn't do it under any circumstances, we do find indeed that there's a significant chunk of the working age population that would give it a go under certain conditions. For example, between 23 and 26% of our respondents would do it, but only if they didn't have to pay for it. And some 14 between 17% of people would do it, but only if then there's a guaranteed job at the end of it. And only a minority would do it, even if they have to pay for it, essentially. This highlights indeed that there's some opportunities for providers and for policymakers to actually convince people to undertake the qualifications required. For example, by guaranteeing full-time employment opportunities at the end of a study period. Indeed, always on the piece of qualifications and career entry, there's also a recognition that at the moment, the way people enter in the sector, so the qualification, the way you show that you have the skills and qualifications to do the job, are rather rigid. And there's a limited role, for example, for the recognition of transferable skills from other sectors. And importantly, also for recognizing the role of lived experience, in particular from the retention interviews emerged with people that work in the sector, emerges that there's people that have would be excellent, for example, social workers, because they actually had lived experience, but there's no formal pathways to recognize that or to support them. And instead, on the other hand, the route of professionalism could actually throw a spanner in the works in that respect, in including in the profession people that could really bring a added value with their personal experience as well as formal qualifications. There's also, as Rob has already touched upon this, people have also, especially in the focus groups, highlighted the importance of educational outreach in educational settings that can raise indeed awareness among especially younger people that might share the values of the community sector, but might be unaware of what are the pathways to enter, essentially. Finally, and finally, this touches to is related to what we discussed above about attracting people from other sectors. Besides asking people to choose between different job ads with various characteristics, we also asked them if they would choose that ad, that job description, above their current role. And we tracked indeed in the survey in which sector was their current or most recent role. And we find we calculated these transition probabilities, which tell us indeed people from which sectors are most likely to be willing to transition to jobs in the youth work or aged care. And we find indeed that people with a background in agriculture, forestry and fishing, accommodation and food services, retail trade, manufacturing and wholesale trade have the highest transition probabilities. So that would be good to target if the intention is to increase the potential base of workers for community sector in the community sector. These would be sectors indeed to think about. On the other hand, there's also sectors where people are working in, for example, in mining, in the public administration, and professional, scientific, and technical services. They have minimal intentions to move to a job in the community sector. So important to bear this in mind to target recruitment strategies. And yeah, I'll leave this to Rob.
Thanks, Arianna, for that comprehensive overview of each of the different findings. The last one I want to quickly touch on is around this retention of staff. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of the broader sustainability of the sector, bringing people in is not enough. We also need to make sure there's an environment for them to stay in this space. These findings were predominantly sort of garnered from the semi-structured interviews. And there were sort of three themes here around. The first one being supportive leadership, management and culture. So staff valued those leaders who understand the realities of frontline work. In a few instances, managers had come in from hospitality or hotel industry because they'd managed people in a living space, but that didn't necessarily correlate to understanding the lived experience and what the work entails on the ground. Also here is organisations that genuinely live their values. So this dimension of care and taking care and working with people in a considered way. I think in some instances, when issues of racism and so forth came forward, staff wanted to know that the organisation sort of had their back and made sure they were sort of going to bat for them. Equally around career progression, those who are already in the space recognise that in order to retain staff, you need to have genuine opportunities for career progression. And this might also come around in even acknowledging the seniority of some staff in playing those mentoring roles that Arianna mentioned earlier. There are some broader structural changes as well that we wanted to highlight. Understaffing, we know, is prevalent, but this understaffing also impacts workload, stress levels, burnout, and so forth. We had a few instances where staff were actively not taking leave because it meant their colleagues would be under more pressure. So again, so I think it's a testament to the staff themselves who are cognizant of the broader impacts of them taking leave, but that also doesn't develop sort of a sustainable culture in terms of retaining people in that space. The gendered nature of the work, Ariane has touched on a little bit, and I think we need to be careful that these different dimensions don't further reinforce this very gendered workforce that is there, because there is a big space for males in the sector, particularly to address some of those dimensions around safety. Some clients may have gendered preferences to be supported by a male or a female staff worker or other. And also, particularly in youth work, the need for these male role models for male youth. Finally, the last one was around some of the challenges around large organizations, and particularly this was to do with youth work and understanding the challenges and needs on the ground from the youth they're seeking to serve, and ensuring that the larger organizations, as opposed to maybe some of the local community organizations, have those connections and able to be responsive to those different needs. So I've just shared a lot of content there with you about some of the broader findings from the research. I think in terms of the recommendations, we sort of crafted them around these three different levels here, where there were the broader systemic sector-wide recommendations. And this required sort of a fundamental shift in how society perceives and support care work. As mentioned, this might include dimensions around public education initiatives and outreach programs to challenge some of those dead-end job perceptions. And there are examples, like I said earlier, from Queensland Police, who've done some really interesting campaigns. I know nursing, the nursing sector goes into schools to actually do some of that outreach. So the examples from other sectors as to how that could be enacted a little bit more effectively in the community care space. It also acknowledges the need for sustained advocacy from industry, from peaks, from champions in the sector, for that increasing of financial support to address some of those minimum staffing issues, to address some of the opportunities around full-time contracts, which have that sort of higher financial barrier. Secondly was the organisational structures. So we had two different dimensions here around organisational supports. There was organisational structures and systems, which focuses more on sort of HR. So organisations being able to reimagine what recruitment and employment practices look like to better attract and retain workers. We've talked about those different targeted campaigns. So targeted campaigns that might talk about the intrinsic rewards of care work, tailoring different message, different sort of groups, and highlighting this relationship building for young people, for instance, and what meaningful work can look like in this space. The prioritisation of permanent full-time roles within sort of HR structures where possible, but again, noting that previous point about the sort of financial implications for that, for how do these sort of support one another hand in hand. The formal career pathways and professional development were also some of the recommendations here, and again, targeting people from different sectors, but also addressing some of the qualification barriers, as can be done potentially through these employment training models, where if there's guarantee for full-time employment afterwards, there's an opportunity to increase the attraction into the space. Finally, here around the cultural and relational recommendations, the foundation of the successful workforce retention for us lies in building that supportive organisational culture that acknowledges the emotional and physical demands of the work that these staff are doing. So it's developing those comprehensive support systems, ensuring that organisations are taking care to promote both these support systems, but also, as Ariane mentioned, acknowledging that putting a big list of support mechanisms in place in a job ad may also deter people. So at what point in a recruitment process do you actively introduce some of those support systems? Maybe after the first interview or the first day of work, it's like, we acknowledge this is heavy, burdensome work. And as an organisation, this is what we're seeking to do to support you in that process. And finally, around the sector leadership, as the sector has become more privatised, how do we ensure that those organisational values that are protecting staff from discrimination, that are highlighting those values, are really at the front consistently? We'll put a link in the chat to the overall report, and you can see some of these recommendations in a bit more detail, where we've tried to look at this also in a short, medium and long term. We recognise this takes time to address some of these broader challenges in the sector, but I think with will and with the leadership that organisations like ASQ are showing, there is real opportunity to demonstrate the values and the opportunities of work in the community care sector in the short term, but also as the sector increases in demand into the future. I'm going to pass it back to you there, Greg, to facilitate the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Rob and Ariana there for providing both the breadth and the depth in terms of the research findings, pointing to some of the implications, but also importantly drawing attention to some of those ongoing tensions between kind of worker well-being and client well-being, and the fact that you can't transport work flexibility options that work in some sectors like knowledge work into a care setting, particularly when it's a residential care setting that needs to be staffed 24 hours a day, because that they don't work in that environment. So what sorts of work flexibility arrangements are suitable for care work, frontline care work is an ongoing question, and some of those propositions were tested in this research. But there's also here an encouragement for organisations to experiment and get the feedback loop on around some of those work flexibility options. And I think the other thing that came through very strongly in what you presented was that importance of economic security, job security. And that's something that we know from public attitude surveys is a constant across generations, across age groups. And again, that's not surprising, particularly in the context of the cost of living crisis, for example, that we're facing. So it's lots there that I think we would expect to see intuitively, but also I think there were still some surprises, particularly around where people might be recruited from. No one was expecting forestry, perhaps, for example, unless tree huggers become into care work, perhaps. But yeah, I think that there's some work to do there, as you said, around targeted recruitment, and just also the emphasis on diversity and what the value of that is in workforce, not just for clients, but also for other workers. And I think we need to keep pushing that value, particularly in the geopolitical context we are in now, around EDI initiatives, particularly in countries like the US that are directly under attack. So I think it's important to highlight those. There's lots there to respond to. So as I said, please do put your questions in the chat, or you can ask them online and live. If you do want to ask them on live, just turn your video on, put your hand up. But I'll just jump now to the chat first to have a look. All right, I've got Morgan first. So Morgan's question was around the gender dimension is interesting in the attraction piece and requires a considered response in addressing. You discussed the implications of the work and suggested actions, but which do you think would have the largest impact on the issue in terms of addressing that gender imbalance, given that the burden of this work is, as we acknowledged, undertaken by women? Any response on what do you think would shift that dial a little bit, Ariana or Rob?
I'm happy to reply to this one. So in terms of which dimension would have the largest impact into increasing diversity, in essence, our findings point dramatically to permanent full-time work. That is the one thing that would attract both men and women, and that potentially puts off men a fair bit. In addition, obviously, there's also then elements of norms, right, about who should be doing care work. That, though, indeed, is not something that can be addressed at the level of the individual organization. That is obviously more of a societal level of mobilization that is required to saying whose job is to take care of others, and men acknowledging to be part of that equation as well. On this, another piece that is not part of this research, but be interesting to see, to work on that further, is around the preferences of clients, because obviously also the clients might have ideas about who should be taking care of them, right? If it's a man or a woman, so preferences in that, so there's stereotypes, right? So that part, even if men wanted to do this job, would clients be happy to actually let them do it? So there's that piece as well, let's say. So in short, starting with contract types, but probably finding a funding model that can fund permanent full-time work and the downtime associated with that, which means having to put more funding in the system. would be the start. Then on top of that, there's this other piece that we have to do as a society, I would say.
Thanks, Ariana. One of the notions I like in Nancy Fraser's work, the philosopher, when you talked about the societal norm, is this issue of, or she, advocates for a universal caregiver model where everyone's responsible for social and economic reproduction. And like you said, that's the kind of cultural shift that we need to see take place in order to support the policies that's going to recognise that in practice to take and see care as everyone's responsibility. We've got another question from Shona. Talked about flexibility and where there's been increased introduction of apps like Mabel. So the role of technology aimed to create flexibility in the community sector. Based on the research, what do you think the role of tech apps and platforms will be in the sector? And obviously, technology is a very big question. And the apps like Mabel are, in some cases, increasing agency on the part of workers who can set their own rates. But yeah, what do you think of the kind of longer term impacts of digital technologies?
Thanks, Greg. I think for this one, there's a few different ways to kind of understand some of the realities around technology. I know Tyler Riordan, who was here a moment ago in the conversation, who's done some work around gig economies. And I think he sort of highlighted the risks of exploitation and advantage through some of these apps. So I think in this instance, certainly being cognizant of not reinforcing some of those negative perceptions through some of these platform-based apps. In some of the conversations we had with Anglicare, there was also recognition that Anglicare, while is a leader in many dimensions in this space, may not be the leader in terms of developing these apps and these platforms, and they may come from elsewhere. So without wanting to diminish the role of technology in the space, there's a bit of a wait and see how these platforms and mechanisms are implemented elsewhere, and then how they can be adapted to the different, as we can see, considering different conditions of what age and youth care, the community care sector looks like. There's also a sort of, there's this temporal dimension as well. I think we've got aged care at the moment. You have a demographic of people in aged care who don't necessarily have high digital technology literacy. There is a push in other sectors to see more technology in order to attract young people in. And I think there's in the short term, until we maybe see more boomers moving into, who have a bit more technological literacy, moving into the aged care spaces, how we transition or we balance that workers and the role that technology plays for them, and the clients and the role technology plays for them. So I think it's going to be a bit of an evolving process as well, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Rob. And new technologies come with a whole host of risks and opportunities, because some of the new technologies around smart homes, for example, can also be assisting people to remain in home longer. But obviously there's a whole, when we're talking about worker wellbeing, we know from other gig-based work, particularly in the delivery service, that there's a lot of exploitation and risk that are transferred onto individual workers that one has to be conscious of, particularly around health and occupational kind of safety risk with app-based work. So lots there to unpick, and I'm sure, as you've said, Rob, we won't be able to sort that out quickly, and it is one that's going to evolve, but it's also one that's rapidly evolving, right? And the regulation, policy, practice responses often come a little slower. I've got another question which I'll go to from Lisa. Lisa Walker, thanks for the question. Was there some consideration of the structure of work, duties, responsibilities, and remuneration systems with a view to increasing the attractiveness of this sector as a career path, and also the quality of care provided in this sector for those whom it would not be so at present? Rob or Ariana, do you want to respond to that?
I can speak to this one. So the structure of work, which has not been part of this particular research, is actually, I mean, we haven't mentioned the findings, but in the focus groups actually emerged an element of need for task variety, so-called. So people acknowledge that doing for a full 8 hours straight heavy lifting work, for example, say with aged care clients, so it would be probably unsustainable. And the ideal, hence, which indeed you could say then the consequence of that let's have casual work, so that like you'll do a bit of hours and then you don't do them. But in reality, probably the best solution in there would be to have still the permanent full-time work and introduce task variety in the work design, in essence. So that is surely a conversation. So we didn't touch on that in the quantitative work we've done, but the qualitative work actually does speak to that. So the importance of alternating tasks that are more emotionally demanding or more physically demanding with less physical and emotionally demanding tasks. Or potentially also having the option, some people in the focus group mentioned, to I mean, it's not possible to work from home, obviously, in the entirety of it, but to do some of the work from home, some of the tasks associated with the job from home, like the more administrative ones, say. So that might introduce also the element of flexibility. In terms of the remuneration system, indeed, so we find that increasing wages is not the main. It does, obviously, it's important. It's very important, but doesn't do as much as the income stability. At the same time, indeed, if we want to attract people from a variety of sectors, the wages will have to be higher for as I have described before. Then I'm reading as a career path, the quality of care. Yeah, and that speaks also then to the career advancement piece. So if there's a wage structure where people can see themselves increase in pay and grow, that's surely going to affect also the attractiveness. And probably is also going to improve the quality of care, because if people, we can assume that if people feel halfway for themselves, then they can possibly also contribute more to the quality of care than they currently do. Rob, please, if you want to go ahead.
Thanks, Ariana. I just want to, I guess, jump on a couple of the comments that Ariana made there around specifically flexibility and the quality of care. One of the findings that came out of the research, which is a bit sort of tangential to your question there, Lisa, was some people working in the sector now acknowledge the desire for more flexibility, but also recognize that some of the patients they're dealing with and working with on a day-to-day basis will not benefit from flexibility. They need consistency of care. They need to see the same sort of faces each day. So I think for me, that was another challenge, but also a testament to some of the workers in this space who had that patient care really front and center, even if it impacted the flexibility or the way they could actually go about doing their work. So, and I guess the other part there, which is interesting for me, and Ariana touched on this a little bit around the structure of work and some dimensions around task aversion. There were some things, toileting, hygiene, particularly in aged care, that people sort of said there was no way they'd touch this at all. And I think that task aversion and going back to then technology, how can some of those tasks maybe be done through technology? What does automation look like in some of those dimensions? But then there's a trust part there too. Do we trust technology to do some of those intimate care parts that maybe are barriers for other people to come into this space? And I think that's probably a space for further research at some stage.
Thanks, Rob and Ariana. We're just about out of time. So one more question from Christine, which I'll just get a very quick response to either of you. From my view, it's a really important issue around psychosocial risks and any of the strategies proactively around mental health prevention, for example, and or suicide that employers could think about more carefully in relation to care work, given the structural challenges you've talked about around the nature of the work and how it's dispersed. But any quick comment from either you, Rob? I know that this comment deserves a much longer conversation, but any quick response?
Yeah, I'll just add to, I mean, absolutely, these are very important. And as I mentioned earlier, when we spoke about the organizational supports, even, I mean, people that are not in the sector, like that we were in the focus groups, know that this has hazards into coming this kind of work, the psychosocial hazards, and acknowledge that they would consider only if they were provided essentially significant support. And this was even more so in the retention interviews. So there's surely a role for investing more in this kind of in the proactive prevention of mental health disorders and or suicide, as per comment, is surely an area of that is very important for retaining staff and also for attracting. So if you do it, it's essentially going to help on both ends in a way.
Thanks, Ariana, and thanks, Rob, in terms of the picking up on those points, and thanks to our participants in terms of raising those issues and comments that we know we're going to require longer attention. And as Rob has highlighted, this is really an issue at all levels, from the organisational, individual, right through to the structural and societal, to get the kind of shift that's going to improve the diversity piece and the retention piece for this sector. So thanks everyone for your participation today, and thanks to Kim Smith, who supported us in the background with the webinar, and stay tuned for more webinars for the Centre for Policy Futures on the website and through our socials, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. And don't forget to download the report as well. And thanks again to our partners, Anglicare Southern Queensland, for continuing this focus and for being willing to experiment with different kind of work design models and to raise this question. It's really important, obviously, for the sector as a whole, but particularly for Anglicare and showing their leadership on this issue. So thanks again to Michelle and Leanne, and everyone else. Have a good afternoon. See you next time. Thank you.